The premise of the book is to look at what liberals did to cause their own decline. Liberalism is a slippery creed. We find its roots deep in the American past. I mean, I think you look at sort of Thomas Jefferson is seen as the godfather, the progenitor of American liberalism in a sense of not just social egalitarianism, but a sense of equal opportunity for all Americans. And if you want to boil what liberalism means, it would mean, a sense that a good America, America at its best, is one in which there is mass social equality and mass economic opportunity. And through the 19th century, it was seen that how to achieve those goals of social equality and economic opportunity was to keep the state small. 18th century liberals saw the enemy of liberty, the enemy of opportunity was a monarchy. So the state was seen as the rival, as the enemy of these ends. By the early 20th century, industrialization, immigration, urbanization is rapidly changing in the United States. And so slowly liberals begin to understand that to achieve these Jeffersonian ends of equality and opportunity, they need to pursue them through what they called Hamiltonian means, meaning big government. And I would argue that that's not a contradiction, because an 18th century liberal, they opposed government, because when you said government to them, that meant monarchy. And so by the 20th century, when they start using Hamiltonian, as in Alexander Hamilton, right, and big government, government does not mean monarchy. And so Jefferson and other liberals were never opposed to government in and of itself, right? They were opposed to, elites, aristocracy, monarchy. So liberalism changes in the 20th century. The means change. You're going to achieve social equality, economic opportunity through using federal activism. So when we talk about sort of federal activism and an executive-led federal government looking for problems to solve, not just solving problems that come to the door of the White House. I mean, this emanates from the New Deal, which was a response to the emergency of the Great Depression. And obviously 30 years later, John Kennedy comes to the White House. There's no Great Depression. And so the pressing problem for American liberalism at that time and for John Kennedy was to update liberalism for an age of affluence. And it was no longer the immediate post-war era. And so liberalism by the early 1960s was still pointed at the problems of depression and the immediate post-war era. And so Kennedy's major task was to update the creed to deal with a society of affluence and a changing Cold War. And so this is Kennedy's task, and it was the liberal project of the early 1960s. How do you update liberalism when you don't have a depression and Joseph Stalin is dead? The wilderness years of American liberals from really 1965, 1966 through the age of Reagan. Liberals lost faith in the American project. I mean, that's just how I would sum it up. And it's understandable. I mean, the tumult of the civil rights era, watching your own countrymen and countrywomen beat African Americans in the street and beat civil rights activists in the street, and watching on television the horrors of Vietnam, a war that Lyndon Johnson himself never wanted, that the American people never wanted. I mean, those two seminal events so enrage liberals, and understandably so, that they begin to question the basic fairness and decency of their own country. And I argue that American liberals, in some, not all, begin to have a more radical critique of American society than what Franklin Roosevelt had or what John Kennedy had. Instead of, piecemeal reform, they want more radical approaches to change America for the better. And so when Middle America feels that their country is being demeaned and attacked, and their own values are being demeaned and attacked by, well, the term is appropriate, liberal elites, meaning, upper middle class, educated, higher income liberals who take over the Democratic Party in the late 60s. I mean, the term liberal elites has been used and is used as a way to pillory liberals, but there's some truth to it at the same time. Middle American voters who had heretofore been the rank and file of the Democratic Party, they turn against their own party and they leave their party because their party took on a different tone towards their country and towards them. Jimmy Carter is, look, who doesn't laud and admire Jimmy Carter? He's the greatest ex-president in American history, period. Jimmy Carter came into office, I would argue, wholly unprepared, one-term governor of Georgia, for the extraordinary burdens of the presidency. But probably even more important than that is the civil war that's going on in the Democratic Party. And Jimmy Carter, I think you can argue, was a new Democrat, meaning a Bill Clinton sort of Democrat, before there was an institutional structure. And it just goes to show that one person, right, cannot change a party. You need institutions. You need to have allies. And the Democratic Party was at war in the late 1970s. It was the old-style true believers who would claim we lose elections because we're not liberal enough, versus Jimmy Carter and a scattering of maybe Hubert Humphrey, who passed away during the Carter presidency, who understood somehow that the Democratic Party had lost its finger on the pulse of the American people. And so Carter, and I have a chapter on Carter's attempt at welfare reform. I mean, welfare was an incredibly unpopular program across the country. Carter understood that. He wanted to reform it. This is something that Bill Clinton does in 1994 and was lauded for it. Carter wanted to reform welfare. The Democrats who controlled the Congress sink welfare reform. It doesn't even get out of committee. And is this partially Carter's ham-handedness, his inability to deal with Congress? Yes. But it also shows you have a Democratic Party fundamentally divided against itself. It was in the Democratic Party's interest to reform welfare, to support its own president. And Jimmy Carter's bill that he introduced on national television, that was one of the major hallmarks of his '76 campaign, it never even saw it never even got a vote. Which it's a revelation that liberals didn't have the ability to reform themselves. American liberalism's low point when Reagan comes into office. I mean, liberals just cannot begin to understand how the country of Roosevelt and Kennedy could have elected Ronald Reagan. On one hand, it reemphasizes their alienation from their own country and believing that Americans are no longer capable of embracing these ideas of social equality and economic opportunity and social justice. So, the idea of Reagan in the White House just sends them into fits of fury. At the same time, you have Midwestern and Southern Democrats who look at, the Reagan Revolution, and they take the really hard steps of understanding that American liberals had lost the pulse of middle America. And what they do is they build an infrastructure, an organization, a set of ideas, of moderate liberal ideas that can retake the center of American politics. And that's what the last couple of chapters are about, is about the rise of the Democratic Leadership Council, the rise of Bill Clinton. And this didn't just happen. I mean, there were, a decade of institution building that went into building policy ideas, building an apparatus so that these moderate liberals, they're not just moderates, they're moderate liberals, can take their party back from what are called new politics liberals, these upper middle class, highly educated liberals who take a more radical critique of American society. Clinton is an interesting figure because he's from Arkansas. He's from middle America. In his gut, he understands the sort of Democrats that Democrats need to win in order to govern. At the same time, this is someone who has an elite education, who worked on the McGovern campaign himself. Clinton has a foot in both worlds, right? He has a foot in the new politics liberal world, and he has a foot in the moderate Democratic Leadership Council world. And so the first couple of years of the Clinton administration, I mean, aside from a few policy successes like his first budget, which reduces the deficit, which, plays a significant role in the booming economy of the 1990s, it was a fiasco because, it was the new politics Clinton who governed, and it was the new politics liberals who, were throughout the bureaucracy of the White House and the West Wing. And so Clinton loses the Congress, for the first time since the 1950s. Republicans take control. Now, there were some longer forces at work, especially in the South, to cause that. But Clinton's first 2 years, were just a disaster. And what he learned, right, and this is to Clinton's credit, he goes, he did this in Arkansas too. His first, it was a two-year term as governor of Arkansas until they changed the Constitution. His first term as governor, he did not govern as a moderate Democrat. He governed as a new politics liberal, and they voted him out. And so what he learned after 1994 is to go back to his DLC roots, to intentionally, govern as a moderate Democrat. And it's just no accident that, with Clinton governing, what he called the vital center, which has a different meaning according to Arthur Schlesinger, and it does, but Clinton meant it, at this sort of, because most Americans support a modicum of liberal activism, Social Security, Medicare, Pell Grants. I mean, most Americans, you see this in electoral results, right? Most Americans, they want these programs. Even when Republicans start to, go after them, even Republican voters, sort of rise up and protest. And so, once Clinton gets through those first 2 years, he governs as a moderate, and especially in the domestic sphere, it's a largely successful presidency, and one that, it promised to end the national debt. He and Newt Gingrich had a secret deal at one time about how to sort of, get rid of the national debt and to begin to end the culture wars that were still continue to plague Washington to this day. Liberalism, I would argue, is in the best position it has been since the Kennedy era because of the institutions and because their opposition is so absolutely, it's just flailing. They don't understand that the American people, generally speaking, are not interested in their solutions. They talk about Ronald Reagan in 2013 exactly like Democrats talked about Franklin Roosevelt in 1980. The problem is it's not 1980 anymore. For the Democrats in 1980, it was no longer 1936, and so they're stuck in the past. They're looking to a political idol and a set of political answers that answered questions from another generation. And so, if I put my money, I put my money on liberals dominating the national landscape because they are the ones, at least, they may not have all the right answers, but they are looking at the right questions. They live in 2013. Conservatives are living in the 1980s.